The morning sun crept over the rolling hills of Pine Valley, its golden light spilling across acres of farmland. For generations, the Carter family had worked this land, turning the soil with their own hands, raising crops and livestock that fed the community. At the center of it all stood the old red barn, a sturdy wooden structure built by Ezekiel's grandfather nearly a century ago. Its paint had faded, its beams weathered, but to Ezekiel, it was more than a barn. It was history, it was memory, it was legacy. Inside those wooden walls, his father had once taught him how to repair a broken plow, how to treat a sick calf, how to work with dignity, no matter how hard the times were. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and earth, scents that reminded Ezekiel of childhood mornings, when he would follow his father, mimicking every movement, determined to one day shoulder the responsibility of the farm. Now, in his 50s, Ezekiel carried that weight with pride. A tall, broad-shouldered black man with calloused hands and deep lines etched across his face. He was the embodiment of resilience. The community respected him, even if few truly understood the quiet battles he faced as one of the last independent farmers in a town increasingly overtaken by developers. At the edge of his land, just past a grove of oaks, loomed something new, the gleaming, manicured expanse of the Pine Valley Resort. Built only 2 years ago, it was the pride of the Homeowners Association, a luxury playground for wealthy families who had moved into the valley seeking country charm, without the grit of real farm life. Its golf courses stretched green and artificial under sprinklers, its swimming pools sparkled like glass, and its clubhouse hosted endless HOA meetings, where men in suits and women in pearls sipped wine and talked about preserving the neighborhood's image. To them, Ezekiel's barn was not legacy. It was not pride. It was an eyesore. At first, the HOA sent letters. Ezekiel read them by the dim light of his kitchen lamp, his jaw tightening as he scanned phrases like non-compliant structure and violating community standards. He crumpled the papers and tossed them in a drawer. His land was his. The HOA had no authority here. Then came the fines. Envelopes marked with official stamps demanded thousands of dollars in penalties. Ezekiel ignored them. He had survived droughts, storms, and lean harvests. He would not bow to a group of people who cared more about tennis courts than soil. But the HOA was relentless. They saw his defiance as a challenge. Rumors began to circulate, whispers that his farm was unsafe, that his barn was falling apart, that his land was lowering property values for the resort. Ezekiel heard the whispers at the feed store, felt the cold stares when he drove his truck through town. Then, one morning, the battle came to his doorstep. Ezekiel was out in the fields when the sound reached him, a deep mechanical rumble that shook the ground. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked toward the barn. His heart clenched. Bulldozers. Two massive machines rolled across his field, flattening crops as they came. Behind them, trucks carried men in hard hats, their reflective vests glinting under the sun. Ezekiel dropped his tools and sprinted, his boots pounding the dirt, his voice roaring across the land. "Get off my property," he shouted, waving his arms. "You don't belong here." The foreman barely glanced at him. He held up a clipboard with a stamped order. Demolition approved. Structure in violation of safety codes. Before Ezekiel could argue, the bulldozers pressed forward. Their steel jaws bit into the barn's wooden frame, tearing beams apart with violent ease. The crash of splintering timber echoed across the valley, drowning out Ezekiel's shouts. Dust filled the air, rising like smoke from a battlefield. Neighbors gathered at the resort's fence line, some sipping coffee, others smirking. To them, it was entertainment, watching the last farmer stand helpless against progress. Ezekiel stood frozen, fists clenched, as memories flashed before his eyes. His father teaching him how to tie a rope, his children playing hide-and-seek in the loft, his wife once hanging strings of lights for a harvest celebration. All of it, every memory, every piece of history, was reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. When the dust settled, the barn was gone. Nothing remained but splintered wood and broken tools scattered across the earth. Ezekiel walked slowly into the ruins, his boots crunching against debris. his breath heavy with grief. He reached down and lifted a cracked board. Carved faintly into its surface were the initials of his father, burned into the wood decades ago. Ezekiel's hands trembled. For the first time in years, his eyes burned with tears. The HOA thought they had won. They thought by destroying the barn, they had broken the man who stood in their way. But Ezekiel Carter was not broken. He was patient. He was rooted in the land. And as he lifted his gaze toward the distant hills, where the Carter Dam loomed against the horizon, a thought began to form. The barn was gone, but the land was still his. And soon, the HOA would learn what it meant to cross a man who knew how to fight with the earth itself. Night fell heavy over Pine Valley, but Ezekiel Carter could not sleep. The house was quiet, the cicadas droned outside, yet his mind churned like the waters held behind the Carter Dam. He sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning, staring at the demolition notice the foreman had waved in his face that morning. The paper was now smudged with dirt and sweat from his hands. But it wasn't the notice that weighed on him. It was the silence outside. For the first time in nearly a century, the fields lay in darkness without the silhouette of the red barn rising proudly against the sky. When Ezekiel stepped onto his porch, all he saw was rubble, broken beams piled like bones, dust still clinging to the grass, the echo of machines that had torn through generations of history. He walked slowly toward the ruins, lantern in hand. His boots crunched against the debris as he stepped inside what had once been his sanctuary. The barn was more than timber and nails. It was where his father had taught him patience, showing him how to mend tools with steady hands. It was where he had danced with his wife one summer evening, music playing from a rusty radio. It was where his children had built forts out of hay bales, their laughter filling the rafters. Now all of that lay buried under splinters. Ezekiel knelt and brushed his fingers across a broken plank. His heart clenched when he saw the faint initials, J.C., burned into the wood by his father decades ago. He remembered the day his father had shown him that mark, telling him, "Boy, this barn is our heart. Take care of it, and it'll take care of you." Tears blurred Ezekiel's eyes. He hadn't cried in years, not since burying his parents, but the sight of that board cracked something deep inside. He pressed his forehead against the wood, the grief raw and heavy. At the resort, the HOA board toasted their victory. Ezekiel knew they were laughing, calling him stubborn, a relic of a past they wanted erased. They didn't see the barn as history, as blood and sweat. They saw only inconvenience, something that ruined the postcard image of their golf courses and luxury cottages. But they had underestimated him. As the night grew darker, Ezekiel walked north, past the fields and into the hills. His lantern swayed, casting long shadows across the land. Finally, he stood before it, the Carter Dam, built by his grandfather after a devastating flood, nearly destroyed the farm. The dam had stood firm for decades, holding back a vast reservoir of water. It was simple but powerful, constructed with stone, steel, and the kind of craftsmanship no blueprint could capture. Ezekiel had grown up helping his father maintain it. Oil the gears, check the valves, inspect the gates. He knew every inch of its body, like a man knows his own hands. The dam wasn't just protection, it was power. He placed his hand on the cold iron of the control wheel. The metal felt alive beneath his palm, humming with the pressure of thousands of gallons waiting behind it. His mind raced. For years, the dam had been a guardian, releasing water slowly to irrigate fields, keeping the farm safe from floods. But in that moment, Ezekiel realized something the HOA never considered. The same water that gave life could also take it away. He looked down the valley where the resort glowed in the distance, its neon signs shimmering against the night. He imagined the golf greens submerged, the polished clubhouse sinking into mud, the pools overflowing with floodwater. He pictured the board members standing helpless as nature reclaimed their empire. The thought chilled him, and yet it steadied him. He whispered to the night, to his father's memory, to the land itself, "They took our heart. Maybe it's time they learned what this land can do. The lantern flickered in the wind. Behind him, the dam loomed tall and silent, holding back more than just water. It was holding back justice, waiting for the moment Ezekiel Carter would let it flow. The weeks after the demolition were some of the hardest in Ezekiel Carter's life. Every morning when he stepped out onto the porch, the absence of the barn was like an open wound. The land still smelled faintly of splintered pine and dust, and in the early light he could see vultures circling overhead, drawn to the emptiness where once there had been life. But the HOA didn't stop with the barn. No, tearing it down only emboldened them. Now that they knew Ezekiel wouldn't bend, they pushed harder. First came the inspectors. Men in khakis and polo shirts with clipboards showed up unannounced, pacing through his fields as though they owned them, jotting down notes about unapproved equipment and hazardous storage. One even had the audacity to take photographs of his livestock, muttering something about smell violations. Ezekiel confronted them. "This is my land," he said, his voice like thunder rolling over the hills. "You don't have a right to be here." But the men only shrugged. "We've got authorization," one replied coldly. "HOA directive. You'll hear from us soon." And Ezekiel did. Envelopes began to pile up in his mailbox, stamped with HOA letterheads and county seals. Each one brought fresh accusations: improper fencing, unauthorized irrigation systems, zoning infractions. Each carried a fine larger than the last, as though the board was trying to bleed him dry one notice at a time. Maria, his sister who lived nearby, urged him to fight them in court. "Zeke, they're trying to drown you in paper. If you don't act, they'll take the land itself." Ezekiel only nodded, though inside, the anger churned. He had seen what courts could do to men like him, dragging them through months of hearings while bills piled high until surrender was the only option. No, he thought, the fight wasn't in paperwork. The fight was in the land. Meanwhile, the resort thrived. Every weekend, luxury cars streamed into the valley, their tires crunching across gravel driveways. Wealthy families checked into the cottages, their laughter floating over the golf course, while sprinklers hissed in the heat. Champagne glasses clinked on patios. From his fields, Ezekiel could hear the faint echo of music drifting across the valley. Parties fueled by the very arrogance that had reduced his barn to rubble. The contrast gnawed at him. His legacy lay in ruins, while the people who destroyed it lounged by pools, sipping cocktails and congratulating themselves. One evening, Ezekiel drove his old pickup along the ridge that overlooked both his fields and the resort. He parked near the dam, cutting the engine, and sat in silence. Below him, he saw the resort's manicured lawns, glowing emerald under floodlights. Artificial beauty, bought with HOA dues. To his left, the dark expanse of his reservoir shimmered under the moon, vast and heavy, with rainwater from the past month. The thought came again, stronger now. The dam. He remembered his grandfather's voice. "This water gives life, boy. But never forget, it can take life too. Respect it." Ezekiel's hand tightened on the steering wheel. Respect. The HOA had shown none. They had disrespected his land, his history, his family. They had laughed while bulldozers chewed through his memories. He stepped out of the truck and walked to the dam's control wheel. The iron was slick with dew, cool against his palm. He had opened these gates countless times in his youth, releasing gentle streams to nourish the crops. But what he considered a gift of life, the HOA might soon learn as a force of reckoning. The pressure behind the gates was immense. He could hear it, the low, constant roar of the reservoir, like an army waiting in silence. All it would take was a few turns, and the land would decide its own justice. He stared down at the resort. Laughter echoed faintly on the night air, careless and cruel. And Ezekiel whispered into the wind, "You took my barn. Let's see how well you swim." The water waited, the pressure built, and deep inside Ezekiel, so did the decision. The summer heat pressed down heavy on Pine Valley, the kind that made the air shimmer above the fields and left sweat rolling down a man's back before he even picked up a tool. Ezekiel Carter was no stranger to hard days under the sun, but this one felt different. It wasn't the weather that weighed on him. It was the thick envelope waiting in his mailbox. He knew the feel of bad news the moment he touched it. The paper was stiff, the seal official. He tore it open at the kitchen table, his calloused fingers trembling just slightly, and scanned the words. His chest tightened. Notice of rezoning. Farming rights revoked. Property designated for commercial development. Mandatory vacation within 90 days. He read it again and again, each word cutting deeper. The barn was gone, his name dragged through endless notices and fines. But now they were after the very land itself. Not just his fields, not just his farm, but the soil his grandfather had broken with his own plow, the ground his father had bled for, the legacy his children were supposed to inherit. 90 days. That was all the county, spurred on by the HOA's petition, was giving him. Ezekiel sat in silence for a long time, the paper limp in his hands. Through the window, he saw the ruined space where his barn had once stood, the earth scarred, the ghosts of his past still clinging to the soil. His father's voice echoed in his memory. This land is who we are, Zeke. Without it, we're nothing. He crumpled the notice into his fist, anger burning hotter than the sun outside. By afternoon, word had spread. At the resort's clubhouse, board members were already celebrating. Richard Daly, the HOA president, lifted a glass of champagne and proclaimed loudly, "That old farmer will be gone before harvest season. Progress wins again." Their laughter echoed across manicured lawns, smug and hollow. That night, Ezekiel drove out to the reservoir. The sky was bruised purple with sunset, cicadas buzzing in the trees. The dam loomed ahead, solid and silent, its gates holding back millions of gallons of water. The air smelled faintly of moss and wet stone, a reminder of the power sleeping behind those walls. He parked his truck and stepped onto the concrete walkway. The iron control wheel sat in the middle, worn smooth from decades of use. He ran his hand across it, feeling the cool steel under his palm, and closed his eyes. How many times had he opened it gently to water the fields? How many summers had he stood here with his father, learning the rhythm of the land, watching streams trickle down to thirsty crops? The dam had always been about life, about survival, but survival wasn't enough anymore. The HOA had crossed a line. They hadn't just taken his barn, they were trying to erase his family's very existence. They wanted his land, his history, his legacy. And if he allowed it, they'd pave over everything, leaving nothing but golf courses and shallow pools where generations of hard work had once thrived. Ezekiel gripped the wheel tighter. The roar of the water pressed against the gates, waiting. He could feel it vibrating through the stone, a deep, powerful heartbeat. With a twist of his hands, he could unleash it all. The golf courses, the resort, the smug clubhouse. They all sat downstream, low and vulnerable. He imagined it clearly. Water surging down the valley, swallowing perfect lawns, shattering glass windows, sweeping away their false paradise. He saw board members scrambling in suits and ties, their power stripped away, their arrogance drowned. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of calm touched him. It wasn't joy, it wasn't revenge, it was balance. Nature's balance. As the stars came out, Ezekiel whispered into the night, his voice low and steady, "You want to wash me out? Then let's see who gets washed away." The decision was made. The dam no longer felt like stone and steel. It felt like justice, waiting in silence for his hand to set it free. The storm rolled into Pine Valley like an omen. Dark clouds smothered the stars, lightning flickered on the horizon, and the low growl of thunder shook the hills. Rain pounded against Ezekiel Carter's roof, tapping harder and harder as if urging him to rise. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the rezoning notice still burning in his mind. 90 days. 90 days until they erased his name from the land. He could hear the distant laughter from the resort, even over the storm. Music, voices, the hollow joy of people who thought themselves untouchable. The HOA board had scheduled a gala that night, a grand celebration of their progress. Cars with tinted windows had poured in all evening, headlights cutting across his fields as guests arrived in their finery. They toasted champagne while his farm, his family's legacy, sat broken and humiliated. Ezekiel rose, pulled on his raincoat, and stepped into the storm. The wind whipped his face, the rain soaked him through, but he didn't waver. He climbed into his truck and drove up the dirt road toward the northern ridge, tires slipping in the mud, engine growling against the incline. At the top, the Carter Dam loomed against the storm-lit sky, its concrete walls glistening with runoff. He parked, left the engine running, and walked to the control wheel. The iron was slick beneath his hands, vibrating faintly with the force of the swollen reservoir pressing against the gates. The rain had filled it to the brim. Nature itself seemed to be waiting for his command. Ezekiel's heart pounded. For a moment he hesitated. His grandfather had built this dam to protect the land, not to destroy. But then the images returned. The bulldozers crushing his barn, the smug smiles of board members raising glasses, the rezoning letter threatening to steal his land. They had disrespected everything his family had built. "This is for you, Papa," he whispered. "This is for every Carter who worked this soil." With a grunt, he turned the wheel. It groaned loudly, resisting at first, then slowly giving way. He pushed harder. The gates shuddered, then lurched open. The sound was immediate and deafening, a roar unlike anything Ezekiel had ever heard. The reservoir surged forward in a monstrous wave, white water foaming as it thundered down the valley. The earth shook beneath him, the air filled with mist and spray. Downstream, the resort glowed brightly in the darkness, its lawns, pools, and luxury cottages lit up like a stage. Within minutes, that stage became a nightmare. The flood hit the golf course first, swallowing the manicured grass in seconds. Sprinkler heads snapped off like twigs, sand traps filled with muddy torrents. The fairways that had hosted businessmen and tourists just hours before vanished under churning water. The surge tore into the clubhouse next. Windows shattered as water poured through, sweeping away tables, chairs, and the carefully decorated banquet hall where the HOA board had been gathered. Guests screamed, their heels slipping on marble floors as the current dragged everything in its path. Luxury cars floated like toys, colliding with one another in the parking lot, before being carried off into the darkness. Ezekiel stood at the top of the ridge, rain plastering his clothes to his body, watching as the empire of arrogance crumbled. The roar of the flood drowned out the cries from below. For a moment, lit by flashes of lightning, it looked as though the earth itself had risen to strike back against the people who had disrespected it. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He only stood still, his face set in grim resolve. This wasn't revenge for him. It was justice. When the waters finally slowed, the resort was unrecognizable. Where there had been glass and stone, there was now mud and ruin. Pools overflowed with filthy water. Chandeliers hung shattered. Lawns looked like swamps. The HOA's jewel was gone in a single night, swallowed by the force of the land they had tried to control. Ezekiel tightened his raincoat around his shoulders and turned back toward his truck. The storm was easing now, the thunder rolling further into the distance. Behind him, the water still raged, unstoppable, undeniable. Ahead of him lay his farm, battered, scarred, but alive. And for the first time since the barn fell, Ezekiel felt something settle in his chest. The balance had been restored. When dawn broke over Pine Valley, the storm had passed, but the valley itself had changed forever. Mist still rose from the soaked earth, carrying the heavy smell of mud and broken wood. Birds circled uneasily in the sky, their calls echoing through the silence that followed the roar of the night before. Ezekiel Carter stood on the ridge near the dam, his arms crossed against the cool morning air. From there, he had a clear view of the resort. What yesterday had been a glittering monument to wealth and arrogance was now a wasteland. The golf course lay buried under a thick layer of mud and debris. The once perfect green fairways were ripped apart, gouged with trenches carved by the torrent. Golf carts sat overturned, their roofs caked in dirt. A few palm trees that the HOA had imported at ridiculous expense leaned at sharp angles, their roots exposed like broken bones. The clubhouse, pride of the resort, was a shell of ruin, Windows were shattered, the elegant balconies collapsed, and one side of the roof had caved in from the weight of water. Furniture floated in and out of gaping doorways with the ebb of the flood. Chandeliers that had once sparkled above HOA banquets now dangled twisted and broken, dripping muddy water like tears. On the roads leading to the resort, chaos unfolded. Reporters had already arrived, their vans parked haphazardly, cameras aimed at the destruction. They stepped carefully through the muck, broadcasting live to the county and beyond. Pine Valley's luxury resort flooded overnight in what experts are calling a catastrophic structural failure of the Carter Dam. But Ezekiel knew better. It wasn't failure, it was reckoning. The HOA board staggered through the wreckage, their designer shoes ruined, their suits splattered with mud. Richard Daly, the HOA president, screamed into his phone, shouting for lawyers, insurance agents, anyone who would listen. Elaine, his wife, stood ankle-deep in water, mascara streaking her face as she shrieked about her ruined investments. Around them, guests dragged soggy luggage through the mire, furious and frightened, demanding refunds, demanding accountability. It was pandemonium. Ezekiel descended from the ridge in his truck, passing clusters of neighbors who had come to see the destruction for themselves. Some were shocked into silence, others whispered in awe, and a few, those who had quietly resented the HOA's arrogance, smiled faintly when they thought no one was watching. At the edge of the disaster zone, Ezekiel stepped out of his truck. Mud squelched under his boots. The cameras immediately swung toward him, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Carter, did you know the dam was unsafe?" one reporter asked breathlessly. "Do you have any comment about the HOA's accusations?" another shouted. "Do you feel responsible for this destruction?" Ezekiel stood tall, his weathered face calm, his voice steady. "That dam has stood for 3 generations," he said. "It did its job. What failed here wasn't stone and steel. What failed was respect. Respect for land, respect for history, respect for the people who've lived here long before there was ever a resort." The reporters scribbled furiously. Some nodded. The board members glared at him from across the wreckage, but they said nothing. They were too busy trying to salvage what little remained of their empire. By noon, the county officials arrived. Instead of hauling Ezekiel away, they directed their questions at the HOA board. Investigations into their unauthorized demolition of his barn were reopened. Lawsuits from displaced guests stacked up by the hour. Insurance companies began whispering about negligence and denied claims. The once powerful HOA found itself cornered, its influence crumbling as quickly as its clubhouse walls. Ezekiel returned home later that day, driving past his fields. They were wet but intact. The flood had spared his land. It had taken only what needed to be taken. His barn was still gone, but in its place was something else. Vindication. On his porch, he sat with a cup of coffee, watching the steam rise into the cool morning air. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his chest eased. He wasn't naive. He knew battles still lay ahead. But for now, the balance had shifted. The HOA had wanted to erase him. Instead, the flood had washed them away. And as the sun rose higher, drying the valley and revealing the scars of the night, Ezekiel Carter allowed himself the faintest smile. Justice, he thought, doesn't always come in courtrooms. Sometimes it comes roaring down a valley, carried by the force of water and memory. Weeks passed, but Pine Valley still bore the scars of the flood. Where there had once been manicured golf courses and shimmering pools, there now lay fields of cracked mud, broken glass, and twisted metal. The resort that had stood as a symbol of wealth and control was gone. Its investors pulled out, lawsuits piled high, and the HOA that had once strutted with arrogance was reduced to a few humiliated members scrambling to avoid prison or bankruptcy. For Ezekiel Carter, life began to shift in ways he hadn't expected. At first, people avoided him, whispering in hushed tones at the feed store and the diner. Some called him reckless, others called him dangerous. But then, the truth started to spread. Local reporters uncovered the HOA's illegal demolition of his barn, their fabricated fines, their campaign of harassment. public opinion turned like the tide. Suddenly, Ezekiel was no longer the villain of Pine Valley. He was the man who stood against corruption and refused to be erased. Neighbors who had once looked away when the bulldozers came now stopped by his farm. An old man named Frank brought over his tractor to help clear debris. A young couple from town delivered a load of fresh lumber. Even children came, painting small signs that read, "Carter Strong," and planting them at the edge of his fields. And then came the day Ezekiel had been waiting for, the day he began to rebuild. The new barn rose slowly but steadily. It wasn't just Ezekiel's hands this time. It was dozens of hands. Friends, neighbors, even strangers who had read about his fight came to help. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, mingling with laughter and the smell of barbecue grills set up by Maria, his sister, to feed the volunteers. For the first time since the demolition, the Carter farm rang with life and hope. Ezekiel stood back one evening as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. The framework of the new barn stood tall, strong beams reaching skyward like the ribs of a giant. It was bigger than the old one, sturdier, a symbol not just of survival, but of defiance. "Papa," he murmured, looking toward the horizon. "They thought they broke us, but we're still here, stronger than ever." Meanwhile, the HOA's collapse was complete. Investigations revealed misuse of funds, fraudulent zoning requests, and blatant harassment. Several board members resigned in disgrace, while others faced criminal charges. Richard Daley, once so smug in his power, was seen leaving town in the dead of night, his reputation in ruins. But Ezekiel didn't celebrate their downfall. He didn't need to. The land had spoken for him, and justice had followed. When the barn was finally complete, Ezekiel hosted a gathering on his farm. Dozens came: farmers, townsfolk, families who had never set foot on his property before. They brought food, music, and laughter. Children ran through the fields, fireflies flickering in the warm night air. Ezekiel stood by the new barn doors, shaking hands, accepting hugs, and feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. As the night wound down, he climbed the steps of his porch and sat with a cup of coffee, just as his father once did. The dam loomed quietly in the distance, its waters calm, its gates sealed. It no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a guardian once again. The barn was back. The farm was alive. The land was his, untouchable. Ezekiel closed his eyes and let the cool night breeze wash over him. For months, he had carried grief, anger, and the weight of injustice. But now, all he carried was pride. The kind born not from wealth or power, but from knowing he had stood tall when others tried to knock him down. The HOA had demolished his barn, but in the end, they had only built his legacy higher. And under the starlit sky, Ezekiel Carter finally allowed himself a smile.